Okay, great. So my name is Tiffany Stevens. I'm the president and general counsel of the Jewelers Vigilance Committee, which has a funny name because we've been around since 1917, serving the jewelry industry for all of the sort of different legal needs that the industry has, which are quite a few actually, from intellectual property to disputes between folks along the supply chain, to anti-money laundering, responsible sourcing, which are some of the things we're going to talk about today. And I'm joined here by my colleague and our senior counsel, Sara Yood, who's going to co-present with me on our piece, and also with our ally, Christina Miller, who's going to talk about some really, really interesting aspects of responsible sourcing. So just to get an idea, are most of you guys in the room retailers, or what's your sort of function in the industry? Yes, please. Retail, gem dealers, consulting. Okay, great. So just want to get an idea of how to make what we have to share with you the most useful it can be. So we're going to give you just sort of a framework of how to think about responsible sourcing in 2020. And it's more complex than you might initially think, and there's sort of maybe more to think about in building responsible sourcing for your business. So Sara and I are lawyers, so we're coming at it from the legal perspective, right? So we work to educate the whole industry, from retailers to every segment, labs, everybody. We also are the organization, the people who face the federal government, state and local and international as well, but mostly federal government, to talk about issues that are relevant to our industry. So we're coming at you with that really sort of legal, technical mindset. And if you ask, okay, what does responsible sourcing really mean from the legal point of view, it really doesn't mean anything as a matter of law. The way that the FTC guides, you might know about the FTC guides, we talk to people a lot about how to advertise jewelry too. There are very specific ways you can talk about what a diamond is and isn't, or what a sapphire is and isn't, right? Either to people along the supply chains or to your customers. But responsible sourcing doesn't have that same kind of technical legal definition.
Sorry,
what?
It just keeps advancing.
Oh, okay. Thanks. So there is no real legal definition. So it is, other than, right, you've got your sort of barriers of fraud. You don't want to be misleading in a general sense or fraudulent, but anything short of that, there really isn't a lot of legal things to go on about what responsible sourcing really means. The other side of that is there are some standards around environmental claims that you can make and eco-friendly claims you can make. The US government has regulated all industries, not just ours, but all industries in the US market, about how you can make environmental claims. So you do have some hard and fast rules around that. They're called the Green Guides, if you ever want to Google it. We also provide guidance around that. And so if you ever want to make any kind of environmental or green claim, then, sorry.
Stand here, it's fine.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is it advancing?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's okay, are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. If you ever want to make any kind of environmental or green claims, there are some hard and fast rules around that. And basically what that boils down to is you have to be able to show actual data. So if you say you're environmentally friendly, you have to be able to talk about why that is. Are you buying carbon offsets, or are you working from a renewable energy grid? You know, you have to be able to actually show that data. So that would be the one sort of like footnote around the fact that there aren't a lot of legal definitions. So Christina's has a lot of beautiful things to say about what else is sort of circulating out there around responsible sourcing and existing international frameworks that you can use, whether that's the OECD standard, which a lot of us turn back to, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, ISO standards, RGC Code of Conduct. There's all kinds of resources for you to build your own sort of personal religion of responsible sourcing based on these initial big frameworks, but there's no legal definition of what responsible sourcing really means. Thank you very much. So today we're going to weave in, we're not going to spend a lot of time, we're co-presenting, so we'll just make it short and sweet, but we wanted to make sure that you were aware of part of what you are responsible for as responsible sourcing in your business, no matter what kind of business that is, if you're dealing with fine jewelry products, and that is anti-money laundering compliance. So we have all been responsible for complying with this as federal law for 15 years now. And if you're a dealer in precious metal, precious stone, or jewels, you have to comply. And there are some severe penalties for non-compliance that have already been in place. And then in the last year, we have been given direct signals and messages from the State Department and the Treasury Department that they will be amping up on their enforcement on this. And I think most businesses, unless you're very large, would have a hard time surviving even an investigation into whether or not you're doing the right thing. So we're really encouraging everybody to go ahead and make sure that they've got this locked down for their business, that they've got the program in place, and that they're once a year taking a look at it. Thank you. So the reason, what is anti-money laundering, or why do we care? It's basically, trying to make sure that you're not being used for criminal purposes, either by so-called terrorists or other types of criminal activity. And so we assume that no one in this room and none of the people we're dealing with are doing it on purpose, right? None of us are trying to launder money, but we're worried about people getting swept up in a web, not even realizing that they're being used in this way. And if the State Department or the Treasury Department figures out, sort of busts a criminal ring in another country and it leads back to you, right? We just never want that to happen to you. And there are some simple steps you can take to make sure that you're breaking any of those ties that might be somewhere in your supply chain. Thank you. So what is money laundering? Someone acquires money illegally, like selling drugs, fraudulent charitable donations. They turn the money through a legitimate business to make it look clean, like buying gemstones, buying Rolexes, and then use the money for an identified purpose, such as terrorism, or use it for fun, buy a yacht, quit your day job. So there are a lot of different ways that this can come up. The government, the federal government, is widening their net. So when they find suspicious people, either in our country or other countries, that they're flagging as people we shouldn't deal with, they are now widening that net to not just that problematic criminal person, but perhaps their cousin who has given them free office space. And if that cousin also owns a ruby cutting facility and you deal with that cousin, you could be at risk of being sort of caught up in this, is one example of what I'm talking about. So that's just right. The unknowingly part is what we're worried about, and just wanting to make sure that you're able to look ahead, do your due diligence, and break any ties that you might have to some of these folks out there. And the key is to really know who you're dealing with. I mean, it's pretty simple at the end of the day. The whole point of an anti-money laundering program is for you to take the steps to know who's really on the other side of your transactions. And so we've previewed this, but who cares about this, right? It's federal law. The Treasury Department cares about it. They're going to enforce it via the IRS. They might enforce it during OFAC sanctions. The State Department has oversight on this. Your bank can come knocking because the banks are also highly regulated in this way, and they see our industry as high risk. And so our businesses get flagged over and over again. So if your bank comes to you and says, I'm getting pressure, I need to see your paperwork and show me that you have a good program so I can go back to my compliance department and I don't have to shut down your account. So we get calls in our office of folks getting notice from their bank that they're going to have their business account shut down if they can't produce this paperwork that they've been compliant. And of course, you've got to always report cash over $10,000, which is sort of part of this wider web. And this applies to just about everybody. There are some very small exceptions, but just about everybody in our business has to deal with this. So dealers who do $50,000 or more in purchase of sale of so-called covered goods, and covered goods are precious stone, precious metals, and jewelry made from the above if 50% or more of the value is derived from those precious stones or metals. So it's just about everybody, and it even covers people who are based in another country but are here at AGTA and sell, they're foreign companies, but they are selling more than $50,000 at the show. They should technically have an AML program because, right, wouldn't that be an easy way to launder money? So we just really want to make sure that everyone is aware of this. This has been the law for a long time. We know that we're going to be getting more pressure in the immediate future on this. So we want to make sure that if this is relevant to you, that you've taken the steps to create your own program and that you're compliant. Sure, go ahead.
Is it $50,000 cash, or is credit card and checks scooped up into?
Yes.
Is it only cash?
It's not only cash. I mean, cash has a special scrutiny attached to it, but it's all types of transactions. So, right, that's a great question. If you're dealing in, however you're doing wire payments or whatever to a foreign supplier, you're going to need to make sure that you have all that paperwork and you know exactly who you're dealing with.
Does the $50,000 relate to a single transaction or transactions over a period?
It's over a year. It's an annual time period. So there is this small exception for some retailers. So retailers who buy only from sellers who can prove that they are US AML compliant don't need their own program, right? Because if everybody you're sourcing from has that sort of safety, then you by default have it. But if you buy from any foreign source of supply, you're going to be back in the category of needing it. If you buy from, not including trade-ins, but if you buy gold or anything else from members of the public, that's going to put you back in the category of needing a program. Estate sales or auction houses, and government-sponsored sales. So it's very hard to be in this. There are some retailers that are going to qualify, but very few are actually going to qualify for being exempt from needing to do this. And Sara's going to talk about the steps, and JVC can help you with this. There are other sources too. We just want to make sure that you are covered and you're aware of this and that you take the steps to make sure that you are covered. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sara.
Thank you.
And I'll do it.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about the actual process of getting compliant with these anti-money laundering regulations. It is complicated, but not that complicated. And JVC and lots of other companies have tools that will help you get compliant. But basically the 5 steps for creating a compliant AML program are appointing a compliance officer, conducting a risk assessment, writing an AML program and policy, training, and then periodically testing your program to make sure it's working. So that first step, appointing the compliance officer. Basically you're deciding somebody in your business needs to be in charge of the AML program and making sure that all these different pieces happen throughout the life of your program at your business. So that person has to be an employee. It has to be knowledgeable about the business, have authority to make decisions on behalf of the business, and they have to be good at documenting actions taken in conjunction with your AML program. Step 2 is conducting a risk assessment. And I know Christine is going to talk about areas of risk a little bit later. But basically, you're just trying to examine your business model and identify areas where your business might be unknowingly used for money laundering. So let's take an example. If you're a retailer and you purchase gold from the public, you don't know necessarily where that gold ultimately came from. You have to then follow procedures to know, okay, if I'm buying gold from the public, I need to take a copy of their ID. I need to comply with any of my local police regulations, with making sure that I'm holding jewelry for a certain period of time. And that's because you don't actually know the source of that product. Yes, coming into your store to sell it to you, you don't know where that person acquired this product. So it's identifying areas like that. And looking at also, where your customers and suppliers are based. If you have foreign suppliers, that's inherently more risky than US-based suppliers that have to comply with AML regulations themselves. And then you're examining how your customers pay you and how you pay your suppliers as well. Step 3 is implementing your AML program and policy. Essentially, that you may know that as part of it is KYC, know your customer or know your counterparty, sends each other to try everybody else in their businesses. You have to do that. You have to tell your suppliers a form saying out and send us back your information. But it's not just that. It's also deciding how you're going to monitor transactions in your business so that you'll know if there's a transaction that is out of the ordinary for your business. It's identifying red flags. We'll talk about what those are, but it's like third-party payments or things that should just make you more aware that, oh, this transaction is than what is normally happening in my business. You will have to document actions taken under your program policy. And then you'll also have to check your supplier and customer lists against OFAC. OFAC is the Office of Foreign Asset Control. And essentially, they have a list of people who, as U.S. citizens, we are not allowed to do business with because they have been identified as terrorists or money launderers or cartel runners or some other thing that the U.S. government does not want to participate in. So you also need to do that once in a while as well. So I talked about red flags. Basically, they're events or transactions that have to indicate an intention to use your business for monitoring or for illegal purposes. So an unexplained third party in a transaction, unusual or new payment methods, a sudden change in a customer's normal business practice, or any documents that are inconsistent. Those are. So what happens when you detect a red flag? You just have to make reasonable inquiries and decide, you can refer to your risk assessment, decide whether or not to engage in the transaction, and then document it. So for example, a long payment for an invoice to their uncle in Macau. So what do? Well, you think, okay, Macau is known to be harboring lots of people who are trying to conceal the source of their funds. Maybe I shouldn't engage in this transaction, but you might investigate and ask your supplier, why are you having me send this payment there? If there's a legitimate explanation, you have to identify that third party the same way that you identify your supplier. So get them to give you their social security number or a business ID, any kind of business ID number, and their information. And you get to make a decision on how to proceed. The Treasury Department isn't telling you not to do business with people. They're telling you to fully evaluate these kinds of transactions before you proceed. So I said, again, you have to cross-check customer and vendor lists with national sanctions lists, and those are some of them there. We suggest that if you are going to do this manually every quarter, take 5 random names from your supplier and customer list and just run them through. It's an online search, so you can run it through that. There's also existing software out there. So if you're a larger company, you can get software that will automatically run your customer and supplier lists through those lists as well. Step 4 is employee training. So you have to train all relevant employees in your business on AML. So there's a list of employees up there. And the training should include the company's AML program and detecting red flags. And essentially, you're going to tell all of these employees that when you see something like this, you need to alert the compliance officer so that the compliance officer can follow their normal procedure. So there's different ways that you can do training. In our AML kit, we have a video. You can hire outside training for employees, or you can develop your own company AML training program. Then you just need to keep record of who attended training and when. Step 5 is periodic testing. The law requires that you periodically test your program to make sure it's working. The law requires that and then does not define what periodically means. So we interpret that as about once a year. You need to go in and check your program and make sure it's working. You have to do a full review of your AML program and all of the documents, looking at transactions to make sure proper procedures are followed, and then prepare results letter for the end of the test. This testing cannot be done by the compliance officer. It has to be somebody who does not report to the compliance officer. It can be someone in the business. So let's say your compliance officer is your controller. Then the CEO of the business can be the tester. Some banks, however, will require an independent third-party testing program, and that is something that JVC can help you with. So how does this all fit into the world of responsible sourcing? Essentially, see AML as your first step towards a responsible sourcing journey, because this is required by law. And if you're not doing this, then there's no point in going down that responsible sourcing road without having this fundamental building block for examining your supply chain. This is one piece of a large multi-agency governmental effort in the US to combat corruption and terrorism, but it provides a framework for asking questions of your suppliers. It should be the first thing that you ask your suppliers is fill out this information, tell me about your business. We need to know if you have an AML program. It also empowers somebody in your business to talk to your suppliers and ask them questions. The compliance officer has that ability and authority to do so. And businesses make frequent evaluation a normal part of operations and can place value in prioritizing ethical values. That is just, it's essentially how we get started on this journey of responsible sourcing. So I'm going to hand it over to Christina now, and she's going to tell us all about what that actually means.
Okay, go ahead. Thanks for the presentation, Sara and Tiffany, and it's thanks to the AGTA for having us here. It's great to see a good group in the audience. The way that the JVC tackles these topics is quite different than the way that I advise clients. So, go ahead. And it's going to seem pretty odd to have a slide of a screen capture that I did last night after I got back from riding with Hassar, who is a very young Iraqi-American student studying here. And we had an incredible conversation that it allowed me to share what I do. He was sharing what he does in his studies. And it came to this. He said, wow, that is really interesting. I trust you. I trust what you're telling me. But, he said, when you go to other countries, when you're talking with other people, do they trust you? So in that vein, when we're talking about, sort of the AML program is this one really tangible example that you're being given of how there's steps in place that aid in capturing truth, we hope, and they use the red flag system to trigger a moment in time where you should be concerned. So it's about you being observant. It helps you trust the people that you're working with. So Stuart Poole of 1948, I'm really going to bring a lot of conversations in that have just been happening while here in Tucson. So yesterday I witnessed a conversation between Stuart Poole, who is a minor vendor of gemstones, and a buyer. And the conversation went like this. Well, Stuart, I've known you for years now. I really trust your mining operation. I do believe that when you tell me your sapphires are coming from this particular mine site, that I believe you. And the buyer said, I like that. I like that I have that relationship with you. But do you have any proof? Can you actually prove to me that the sapphire I have in my hand is from that mine? And so they went round and round in discussion about whether or not what would actually verify it. If I had my miners, when they're panning out the alluvial deposit for the sapphires, and they weigh it with all the sort of content, and then they weigh it when they have separated the rough out, and then they report that on a monthly basis on all their information, will that then, reported over time, compared to what they're selling, be enough proof? Now that didn't work out either. So we're still, even though we are in this place, we're kind of in this space in the development of responsible sourcing where we still really have to lean in heavily on trust and have those conversations. At the same time, we are really looking for ways that proof can be aligned so that the two are an easier marriage. Heywan Zwedi from Ethiopia. She's Ethiopian American, and she is another one where you sit with her and you immediately trust her. Her spirit feels kind. Her intent as her business grows to help women in Ethiopia who have to leave their country often because there's no work, and they end up going into trades that involve human trafficking. They're in other countries. They'd rather stay at home. They'd rather stay where they're from. And so she is working to grow her business. She explained to me that she's pretty happy with how the Ministry of Mines is evolving its artisanal mining laws in country, which gives her more confidence as a buyer of these stones to trust that things are going better. There also have new laws on the exporters, so you have to have a license to be an exporter, you have to have a license to be a miner, and the government is also setting up minimum prices so that the miners are paid a fair wage. So how do we know for sure that the stones that are coming from Heywan from Ethiopia are meeting these requirements of fair trade, basically? We have to trust her. So we have a little bit of a steep challenge ahead of us because turns out we have a truth default theory that plays out in our everyday lives, and that is that we believe in our nature, we believe what people are telling us. I meet you for the first time, you tell me an incredible story about your family, I believe you. I don't have a lot of reasons not to believe you. But as this industry is evolving to needing the evidence, needing the proof, and we're hearing stories about how fraud is occurring. We're hearing stories about how gemstones are illegally crossing borders and coming in as one thing when they're another, where the origin claim doesn't actually match, when you base it on what you know about gemstones from other places. We have to fight really hard against this default nature, but at the same time, this is what gives us joy in interacting with each other. So the dream is that the proof, the data points, the proof that we're building become the neutralizer, right? So that you can share your proof with me, we share our proof back and forth, and then hopefully we can go back to enjoying our nice relationship with each other. As you know, the majority of colored gemstones are coming from artisanal and small-scale mine sites. 90%. This is a statistic from PACT. It's a large NGO, and also gold gemstones. So imagine if the majority of gemstones are coming from all over the world, all these little tiny pockets of people trading. It makes for a really difficult situation to understand the supply chain and get the proof. In environments like this, where people are driven often to these activities out of poverty. So they know there is a natural deposit where they might be able to do some mining. They know that there's a market for it. They might be able to do some selling, but they don't know how much to charge. They don't know what the value is of their material. They don't know the people that are buying the material from them. And so they are also stuck in this weird trust relationship, and they're also stuck in the poverty cycle. So imagine traceable supply chain from this environment makes it really complicated. You go further up the supply chain. Thank you, Eric Brownwort is in the room. Brought Jagdish Patel to the Chicago Responsible Jewelry Conference. You get further up the supply chain, and we also have these issues there where we don't have transparency. We want to trust that the beads that we're buying have not harmed anyone in the process. The likelihood is that many of them have caused incredible difficulty for people, and this is an example of one of those stories. There are a lot of efforts in place to try to address this particular situation. From the highest level, so we've got the United Nations developing sustainable development goals. And each of these particular 17 goals has very clear guidelines underneath of what qualifies as a development tool in this space. So what are they trying to do? They are trying to prevent environmental destruction. They are trying to lift people out of poverty. They're trying to create more equal rights for women. They are trying to do any number of topics. And they provide a framework that helps you start to make decisions about what to look for in your supply chain. These steps, so the OECD is another UN level, very top, high looking down. These are the basic criteria that they are recommending for responsible sourcing. And it's very, very similar to the AML protocols that Tiffany and Sara were describing. So have a good system in place. Look really closely at your supply chain. Really unpack it. Ask the questions. Go very deep. Design and implement strategies to manage these risks. So you're going to find that you're going to realize that your gemstones or your gold is coming from a particular country. You've read a Human Rights Watch report about that particular place. There are some ways that you can start to identify where the risks are within that. Carrying out third-party independent audits of a supply chain. This is really, really doable for large companies that have teams in place to help with these kinds of systems. Carrying out third-party independent audits is a little bit harder when you're buying gemstones, for instance, from all over the world, and you need to try to understand that traceability through in that whole system. But it helps to establish credibility. If you find something, you should talk about it. But this is a due diligence process. So let people know, let your customers know what you're doing as you investigate your supply chain. So due diligence is not something you do once and then your work is finished. Due diligence means that you're doing it over and over and over again, and you keep checking up on your supply chain. So in my work, my colleague and I have interviewed multiple suppliers, and then our clients have taken that interview strategy out to their suppliers. So it's kind of becoming an expanding set of questions. Some of you in this room, I know, have received a set of questions from clients that I've worked with. And one of the things we really emphasize is a balance between be realistic in your expectations. So you have a number of things that you can begin to look at. So with artisanal mining, one of the key things that is being encouraged from country level to international level is that artisanal miners are legal. Sounds like a pretty basic thing, but if you're a country that has very limited capacity to even write your own laws, getting down to the detail of writing a law for artisanal mining is like one of the last things on your list to do. So there are some countries that don't have great legal systems in place. And then even the idea of a group of miners getting together and forming a cooperative or a collective so that they can better advocate for themselves is still, in many cases, difficult to attain. So as you're reaching out to your suppliers, get a really good understanding of what are they actually capable of, and set your expectations accordingly so that where, as you're hoping that the situation improves over time and where you're investing efforts for it to improve over time, match the whole picture. This is just a bit of a pause in the presentation to remember, again, like this is where we're going, right? You're going from a place in the world, Tanzania, in the middle of a dirt pile, and somehow that gemstone makes its way through the various supply chains, ends up on the floor of AGTA at a booth for sale. The gemstones are purchased by a jeweler or designer, made into jewelry, and then they are purchased by the consumer. So not only do we have incredible responsibility to communicate the story of those materials so that people understand it better, but if possible, this is again one of those things, could the consumer who's purchasing that necklace have the actual proof that those stones were in fact purchased, sourced, mined, etc., in a responsible way? Within our own business, this is the process that we walk clients through to better understand their practices. And key to this is also taking a moment and really recognizing what it is that you want to communicate about your own values, your own expectations. So it is okay if for you, your interest is in environment. It is okay if your particular interest is in human rights. It is okay if your particular interest is in making sure that you have all the proper paperwork, that you want in order. Whether you want to make sure that the place you're buying from is supporting women. You get to kind of decide for yourself, to a degree, what you would like to emphasize in the practices. And then keep going, because we get into some specifics. So buyers of gemstones, buyers of gold, oftentimes we're seduced by the material. We have this want of the material. Before we then ask ourselves the question of, does the want actually reflect what we're getting in that material, or does it represent the values that I would like to put out in the world? And so asking your suppliers a series of questions. I'm going too slow, so just keep going. Yeah. Some basic things to get going is first, if you're relying on your supplier, who is sort of this buffer in some cases between the mine and you. Sometimes you have suppliers that are also miners. You have a number of different possible arrangements within that, or you could have suppliers that are doing any number of those things. And so getting to know their business first with some basic open-hearted interview questions. How long have you been in business? Where have you been operating? What challenges have you seen in the industry over time? Do you have any special relationships with your suppliers? Those kinds of things get a conversation going, and you find that the person that you're interviewing tends to offer quite a bit of information. And then from there, you can start to drill down. And we tend to emphasize if the supplier is making a claim, if the supplier is saying, all my gemstones are Sri Lankan sapphires, then one of the things you really drill into when you're doing that interview with them is how are they able to prove, what evidence can they provide that all of those gemstones are from Sri Lanka? And back to Stuart Poole, did the particular sapphire that I have in my hand right now come from your mine? There are some tools that are available to you that are kind of interesting. This is a new app that was put out by the US Department of Labor. You can look it up, iLab. It's tracing things that aren't so fun to learn. This is forced labor, child labor, some of the worst forms of child labor, and a few other factors. But you can download it and you'll see the list of materials that apply to the jewelry industry are up in that box on the right. But you can see known kind of country of origin issues. So emeralds from Colombia come up with risk of child labor. And it also updates in terms of what the US Department of Labor has gathered new statistics on. You can see those update reports within the app. So it's kind of interesting. You have your own internal practices. So a code of conduct is a really basic way for you to communicate what you expect from your suppliers. And that code of conduct needs to cover some basic things. It needs to cover the labor. It needs to cover environmental practices. It needs to cover whether or not your company has a grievance process. And the grievance could happen anywhere along your supply chain. You have to have a way for people that are upset with you to report to you so that that information can be handled before there's a problem in the supply chain. And the codes are based on openly accessible materials like what the Responsible Jewelry Council provides, or SA 8000 is another standard, or the International Labor Organization is another standard. So you can also, if the code of conduct isn't the way that you want to go about communicating outward, you can send a questionnaire of key questions that you would like your supplier to answer and respond to. Again, this is a due diligence step. It's not proof. This still lives in the realm of trust through that system. Thanks. So, something else that's developing is how do we use data? And I specifically put this in because of my friend Jared Holstein. And so, on the left, Pivot is a medical NGO in Madagascar that's doing work to build hospitals, but they're not building the hospitals. They're basically just supplying the bricks at a low cost, and then people are building local hospitals and so on. But so you can take this data, because now we're getting at what is it that we're actually trying to change? What's our vision? So you can see what's up on the screen about Madagascar. The population is a little different when you look at some other sources, but 72% of people living in extreme poverty, 54% of families have no toilet or latrine. And then you look on the right, look how this is impacted by our industry. Madagascar is the world leader in sapphire production as of 2007. This may change, this is Wikipedia. So, how does that sit on your conscience for a minute as being in the gem and jewelry trade, where for a significant period of time, now we're talking 12 years, where we are now. For 12 years, mining of sapphires and the selling of sapphires has been really predominant in Madagascar. But we don't know if the sale of those sapphires has had any positive or negative impact on these really sad statistics about what life is like for the people of Madagascar. So all this work is moving in a direction where the proof is based on data, and it is helping us to make decisions to improve lives. Okay. I put this random blockchain slide. It's just a screen capture from doing an image search online because there are so many of them out there. But how many of you have heard of blockchain in the room? A few of you. It's basically, in the most simple way I can describe it, it's basically like an online accounting book where everyone that is participating in a network of purchases and sales can see the information. They have access to some of it, not all of it, and its intent is to improve traceability and ultimately trust. So here's a merger between data, like the example of Madagascar, a blockchain system coming together in a tool that was developed by an organization called Consensus. And Consensus actually grew out from a jewelry company called Fairtrade Jewelry Company. They now go by FTJ Co. And the founders of that jewelry company are actually computer programmers in their background. And so they wanted to figure out a way that they could connect the data on the ground in a system that is trustable and transparent, and then bring that gold to market to the jewelers. In order to do that, they partnered with an NGO called Impact. It used to be called Partnership Africa-Canada, because Impact is really expert in development projects. So the jewelry company, they're a jewelry retailer, they grew a second arm to do consensus. They knew that they were not expert in understanding what the real development issues were in the DRC around artisanal gold mining. So they formed a partnership to be able to do this initial project, and this is the kind of information that their system would allow you to have access to. So now we're in a space where we're wondering, do consumers want to know this much information? So a company like FTJ Co., who is now selling just gold from that program that I just showed you, what they're going to want to do is communicate outwardly their progress over time. And this is something that anybody can do. You set up some goals for yourself, you work to achieve them, you report them out. This is how gradually we change the industry and have impact. Finally, there are some groups that you can go to support. There are some groups that you can go to help you market your materials. And this is where it gets really sticky. So Sara and Tiffany mentioned claims, the eco claims, the claims of origin, all of these. Whenever you say with conviction and in a public way, this was mined in a responsible way, you need to be able to provide the evidence of such. Our social media frenzy has done a disservice to transparency in this space. And so you can easily hashtag sustainable, hashtag fair trade, hashtag responsible, all these things. But in that simplification of the terminology, we don't get to see the proof. So we have to be really careful about how we use that language. Places to go for more information. There are a few films about gemstones, but I included these documentary films about gold because I've seen all three of them, I've participated in them, and so I can vouch for their quality and the way that they're communicating the story. There are opportunities to learn more at conferences. And finally, really digging in sometimes is the best way to make a difference. So you can do your code of conduct. That's your due diligence work. That's you saying, these are the things that I would like to do. But sometimes you have to dig in and you have to take on a project and you don't know if it's going to work. So if you can partner with an NGO, that's really helpful. So in this project, my organization is partnered with Ethical Metalsmiths as well as the Alliance for Responsible Mining. We're working with one particular mine to start with to remediate a polluted area of mercury. So taking on those kinds of projects helps to move things forward. And so the last thing I wanted to do with you all as we finish up is what's lacking right now is vision. So when you hear a bit of this story, and things are starting to come together, right? We're seeing change, we're hearing, okay, if I really want to try to make a difference, and I can't just say I'm trying to make a difference, or I need to be able to prove it. Now we're hearing, but I want the data to measure the impact so that I can say this impact is changing over time. So women are now earning money at a gold mine and they weren't previously, and I can measure that effect over time. So in 20 years, actually in 10 years, let's make it a lot closer. What do we want? What would the dream be? Would the dream be that, that we have the proof we need so that we can trust without question? Is it that we know we can actually measure the impact and we know that our purchases are having the intended effect that we want them to have? I purchase sapphires from Sri Lanka, from a particular mine. I want to know that those particular miners are living a good life, relative to the opportunities that are available in that country at the time. I want to make sure that they're not being harmed by the purchaser of those stones. Any ideas? Is there anything else? I'm just randomly things off the top of my head. Any vision that comes to mind that you would like to see if you could state it. So it's two parts. One is like where you're applying the credential, right? And then the other is making sure your practices take the time to get to know the people that you're working with. Anybody else?
Can you speak a little bit to the state of the current regulatory environment, both nationally and internationally? I know we talked a little bit about the money laundering side, but about, I mean, obviously we know with diamonds and Kimberly process and some of these other things, but as it relates to other gemstones, other processes, what's current, what's on the table?
I am not the best one to answer that question at the moment. So it's changing. I definitely know that in the EU, the standards are becoming more strict. This is part of the reason why the Responsible Jewelry Council is now pulling gemstones, colored gemstones, into its system. Can you speak to that?
There's not really anything in the US that's requiring the same amount of control like the Kimberly process is for diamonds at the moment, and we don't see any legislative movement on that in the US. What we do see is increased scrutiny from the State Department into the supply chains of the jewelry industry in general. So we think that the State Department is focusing on the sourcing of goods, how they're moving through the supply chain, but it's not necessarily like a legislative solution. If something happened, it would be through executive orders from the executive branch of the government.
The laws, I don't think have changed, but oddly enough, under this administration, the application of them has.
Yes.
We import rough stones from a lot of countries. That's pretty clear. It comes from Nigeria or wherever. But then we send those stones to our cutting facility in China. Now, a change that's just happened in the last few months, when they come back, every single line item of gemstones has to be listed as to which country they came from, even though now technically under WTO they're a product of China. So we have to individually list all of them, and we are now being required to do the, whatever it is, whatever that website is. We're having to go, and for customs,
The harmonized tariff codes.
line item that's coming back
Yeah.
into the country. So it's being applied in a much stricter sense. And I don't know who that is. I'm assuming it's State Department. But
It's customs, actually.
it's hours and hours and hours of work for us for every import, and we import weekly.
Yeah, so the U.S. Customs is increasingly focused on origin, and frankly, we think that a lot of it is because of their punitive tariffs that they're levying on various countries, and they want to make sure that people aren't hiding the source of their goods to avoid tariffs. So I'm going to go ahead to our last slide and just say that we have about 4 minutes for questions. So if you have any additional questions for any of us, we would be happy to take them now. And if you could use the microphone because they are recording this presentation, that would be very helpful. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that in this presentation, maybe I missed a little something. I saw the chart where they were looking for goals of maybe 50% being employed by women. Or all I know is the mining that I've seen around the world, my God, you wouldn't get me to do it for anything. And to me, having a woman diving down for sapphires or climbing up the mountains really high in Afghanistan to mine is cruel. Did I not get something here?
Is it more cruel than having a man do it?
I think a man's body is built better.
I don't think so.
So in a lot of cases, there are women who no longer have their husbands due to violence, or they've left their husbands because they were subject to violence. And the only available work in that particular environment is mining. And so they are driven by necessity. No one is, I mean, wouldn't it be nice if there were other means of earning an income that,
Like cutting.
well,
Having a woman cut, I mean, personally, I don't know, I've never done it, but I would think a woman would be better at that than a man, personally.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that point of view. Yeah,
So,
yeah,
I don't know.
thanks.
Ironically, my business just in the last couple of months and then a patriot in my state had a similar situation. We are groping with a customer that has a good deal of gold and gemstones to sell. And we feel on our gut level, that true thing, that he's legit. And we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's, getting all of the necessary police paperwork. Nothing has been a cash transaction. So essentially, if we're writing a check and we're doing the legal documentation, are we meeting the anti-money laundering criteria?
Okay, so my first question will be, do you have a written AML program?
No, we do not.
Okay, so then-
It's funny, this has never come up before.
Then, not necessarily. I mean, it depends. Are you a retailer?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and your purchases of products back from the public, do those purchases equal $50,000 a year or more?
Not yet.
Okay.
This one transaction put us close.
Okay, so then, no, you are still exempt because you're a retailer, your activity is limited to those categories like, do you have foreign suppliers and are you purchasing from the public? And if those transactions don't hit $50,000 a year or more, then you don't have to have a written program. However, you still need to do your due diligence by taking this person's identification information, following all of your local laws about purchasing from the public and holding things for certain amounts of time and things like that. It does sound like you are following the correct path.
Okay, good, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, something you just did.
Yes.
Come to an end. Thank you.
Okay, so that is the end of our time, and I've been signaled like 3 times by the person in charge that we need to wrap up. But the 3 of us will stick around for a little bit more afterwards for any additional questions you have. And we thank you all very, very much for coming at 9 a.m. to hear us talk about this subject. It's very gratifying. Thank you.